Love songs were never just about love. Some of the biggest hits, from the Rolling Stones to Guns N' Roses, carried something darker beneath the surface. Control that sounded romantic. Obsession that felt normal. Even violence, delivered like a joke. This list does not jump straight to the worst. It builds, from subtle manipulation to something you cannot ignore anymore. And once you hear it clearly, you will not hear these songs the same way again. Control disguised as confidence. Number 10, Under My Thumb.
Under my thumb, the girl who...
At first, it does not feel dangerous at all. It sounds smooth. It feels confident. It even carries the tone of something close to romance. But everything changes the moment you actually listen. This is not a love story. This is a shift in power. Under My Thumb by the Rolling Stones is not about connection. It is about control. It tells the story of someone who was once equal, slowly being reduced into something easier to dominate. Dominance presented as victory. The message is not hidden. It is celebrated. The song describes reshaping someone's identity, breaking down independence, turning resistance into submission. And what makes it deeply unsettling, it sounds like a triumph. The danger hidden inside a catchy sound. The melody feels bright. The rhythm feels inviting. It is the kind of song people sing without hesitation. And that is exactly where the danger lives. Because without realizing it, you are repeating a story about control, not connection. A reflection of its time, released during the 1960s, an era often associated with freedom and liberation. This song reveals something very different. It shows that behind the language of love and revolution, there were still attitudes that refused to change. And that is why it endured. Not because the message was questioned, but because it was accepted, played on the radio, celebrated by audiences, and rarely challenged. Next, this time it is no longer about control. It becomes a threat. Number 9, Run for Your Life. Jealousy that sounds like a threat. This time it does not hide behind charm. There is no subtlety here, no poetic disguise, no attempt to soften what is being said. From the very beginning, it feels wrong. This is not love. This is possession turning into violence. Run for Your Life by the Beatles takes jealousy to a place that crosses a line. It is not about fear of losing someone. It is about control so extreme that it turns into a threat, a warning that if she belongs to anyone else, there will be consequences. A line that changes everything. There is a moment in the song that defines it completely. A statement so direct that it strips away any illusion of romance. It is not metaphor. It is not exaggeration. It is the idea that violence is justified if control is lost. When obsession replaces connection, this is where the shift becomes clear. What starts as attachment turns into ownership. What sounds like love reveals something much darker underneath. Because in this story, she is not a person making choices. She is something that must not leave. The unsettling contradiction, what makes this even more disturbing, is who it comes from. A band often associated with love songs, harmony, and cultural change. Yet here the message feels completely different. Almost like a crack in the image people believed. Accepted despite everything. And still, it was released. It was heard. It became part of an era. Not rejected. Not buried. But absorbed into the soundtrack of its time. The escalation is clear now. This is no longer about subtle control. This is about what happens when that control is threatened. Next, the line between admiration and something far more uncomfortable begins to blur. Number 8, You're 16. When innocence becomes something else.
You're beautiful and you're mine.
This time the discomfort is quieter, but deeper. There is no threat. There is no aggression. Everything sounds soft, sweet, and harmless. And that is exactly what makes it unsettling. This is not just admiration. This is a blurred boundary. You're 16 by Ringo Starr presents itself like a simple love song. Bright melodies. Gentle delivery. A tone that feels almost innocent. But underneath that softness, there is a line that should not be crossed. When age becomes part of the fantasy, the entire focus of the song is built around youth, not maturity, not connection, but innocence itself. And it is not treated carefully. It is romanticized. The illusion of harmlessness. Nothing in the sound warns you. There is no darkness in the arrangement. No tension in the performance. It feels safe. which makes the message easier to accept, without ever questioning it. A different kind of discomfort. This is not loud or aggressive like before. It is subtle, and that subtlety makes it more complicated, because it shows how easily something problematic can be presented as normal, even sweet. A product of its time, songs like this were not hidden. They were played openly, enjoyed widely, rarely challenged. And that says something important about what people were willing to overlook. The pattern is becoming clearer, from control to threat, and now to boundaries that quietly disappear. Next, it gets darker. This time there is no innocence left to hide behind. Number 7. Stray Cat Blues. When boundaries are crossed without hesitation. This is where discomfort becomes impossible to ignore. There is no softness left, no illusion of innocence, no attempt to make the story feel acceptable. From the very beginning, it feels wrong, because this is not ambiguity anymore. Stray Cat Blues by the Rolling Stones does not suggest. It states. It presents a situation where age and power are no longer blurred. They are clearly unbalanced. And still, the story moves forward. Awareness makes it more disturbing. What makes this darker than before is the awareness inside the narrative. There is no confusion about what is happening. No denial. No attempt to justify it. Just a perspective that continues anyway. Desire without boundaries. At this point in the list, everything shifts. This is no longer about control in a relationship. No longer about jealousy or emotional tension. This is about desire that ignores limits completely. Nothing in the sound holds it back. The music feels raw, unfiltered, driven by attitude rather than reflection. And instead of questioning the message, it carries it forward. A moment where rock pushes too far. Rock music has always been about breaking rules. But here, it crosses into something else. Something that feels less like rebellion and more like disregard. The escalation becomes undeniable. What started subtly has now become explicit and far more uncomfortable. Next, this pattern does not fade. It becomes fixation. Number 6 for Christine 16. Obsession that refuses to hide. This time, it does not pretend to be innocent. There is no softness masking the intent. No ambiguity in the message. No space for misinterpretation. What you hear is exactly what it is. This is no longer a blurred line. This is fixation. Christine 16 by Kiss takes the same uncomfortable theme and makes it direct. The focus is not on connection, not on emotion, but on a specific image, repeated and obsessed over. When repetition becomes the message, the name itself is not subtle. It is emphasized, repeated, turned into the center of attention. And with every repetition, the intention becomes harder to ignore. Desire without reflection. There is no questioning here, no hesitation, no awareness of consequences. Just a perspective that moves forward, as if nothing about it is wrong. The sound amplifies the problem. Loud guitars, high energy, an anthemic feel designed for crowds, and that energy does not challenge the message. It elevates it, turns it into something people shout together, from subtle to undeniable. At this point, the pattern has fully evolved. What started as hidden control, then became threats, then blurred boundaries, now stands fully exposed, and yet it still worked. It was played. It was performed. It was embraced, not questioned. Next, this is where things become even more uncomfortable. Because now, it is not just about obsession. It is about power, history, and something far more controversial. Number 5. Brown Sugar. When history, power, and desire collide. This is where the tone changes completely. It no longer feels personal. It no longer stays within relationships. This time, it reaches into something much bigger. This is not just controversial. This is uncomfortable on multiple levels. Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones is built on energy. Fast rhythm, iconic riff, a song that feels alive the moment it starts. But underneath that energy, there is a narrative tied to power, race, and exploitation. When the past is turned into imagery, the song pulls from historical themes that are already painful. But instead of reflecting on them, it blends them into something else. something stylized, something provocative, something that turns suffering into atmosphere. Desire mixed with domination. At this point, the pattern evolves again. This is not just about control or obsession. This is about desire framed within imbalance. Where power is not equal, and never was, the contradiction becomes sharper. What makes it even harder to process is how good it sounds. The groove is irresistible. The performance is electric. And that contrast creates tension between what you hear and what it represents. A song that refuses to sit comfortably. Even today, it remains debated, not forgotten, not erased, but constantly questioned, because it forces a reaction, whether you want to engage with it or not. The escalation continues. This is no longer subtle. This is no longer hidden. Now, it is layered, complex, and impossible to ignore. Next, it shifts again, from power and history, back into something that feels familiar, but no less objectifying. Number 4, Centerfold. When fantasy erases the person. This time it feels familiar. Too familiar. There is no darkness in the sound, no tension in the delivery, no warning that anything is wrong. Just a catchy hook, a playful tone, a song that feels easy to enjoy. And that is exactly why it works. Because this is not about a stranger. Centerfold, by the J. Gales Band, tells a story that feels almost innocent at first. A memory, a crush, someone from the past, but then something changes. That person is no longer seen as who she was. She becomes an image, not a memory, not a human being. An image, a version of her that exists for attention, for display, for consumption. And in that moment, everything else about her disappears. When recognition turns into objectification, the shock in the song is not concern. It is not empathy. It is not curiosity. It is disappointment. Because the person he once knew no longer fits the version he wanted to remember. The illusion of ownership over someone's identity. This is where it becomes unsettling. The idea that someone should remain the same. For your comfort, for your memory, for your expectations. And when they change, they become something else entirely. A fantasy that replaces reality. She is no longer a person making choices. She becomes a symbol, a projection, a surface to react to. And that reaction says more about him than it ever does about her. Wrapped in something that feels harmless. The melody is bright. The energy is upbeat. The tone feels almost playful. And that contrast hides everything. Because it allows the message to pass without resistance. A reflection of how easily people become images. At this point, the pattern shifts again. This is no longer about control, no longer about threat, no longer about obsession alone. This is about erasure, about how quickly a person can be reduced into something flat and public. And that is what makes it linger, because it does not feel extreme. It feels normal, recognizable, relatable, even nostalgic. And that is what makes it dangerous. Next, the energy rises again. The volume gets louder. And the line between fantasy and reality starts to collapse even further. Number 3, hot for teacher. When fantasy crosses into authority. This time, everything is louder. The guitars hit harder. The tempo moves faster. The energy feels explosive from the very first second. It sounds like pure fun, unfiltered, reckless, completely alive. And that is exactly what makes it dangerous. Because this is not just fantasy. Hot for Teacher by Van Halen takes desire and places it inside a space that was never meant for it. A classroom, a position of authority, a boundary that is supposed to exist for a reason. When lines are erased for entertainment, at first it plays like a joke, a wild idea, an exaggerated scenario, something not meant to be taken seriously. But the more it unfolds, the more that boundary disappears. Power turned into attraction. This is not just about desire. It is about where that desire is directed, towards someone who represents control, structure, authority. And instead of questioning that dynamic, the song celebrates it. The crowd becomes part of it. What makes this even more intense is how it is delivered. This is not quiet. This is not subtle. It is loud enough to fill arenas, chanted, sung together, turned into a shared experience. When humor hides the tension, Everything about it feels playful. The tone, the performance, the attitude. And that humor creates distance. So the deeper implications never fully settle in. But the pattern is clear now. From control, to threats, to blurred boundaries, to obsession, to power and history, to objectification. And now, authority becomes part of the fantasy. This is where the line almost disappears completely, because once authority becomes entertainment, it becomes easier to ignore why that line existed in the first place. Next, there is no disguise left, no metaphor, no complexity, just pure excess, and nothing holding it back. Number 2, girls, girls, girls. When excess turns people into entertainment. This time, there is no disguise and no subtle message to uncover. Everything is presented openly. Everything is direct. Everything is designed to be consumed without hesitation. Because this is not about connection in any form. Girls, Girls. Girls by Mötley Crüe captures a world driven by constant stimulation. A world filled with noise, movement, and endless distraction. But within that world, people are no longer treated as individuals. They become part of the experience. Not someone with identity or depth, not someone with perspective or voice. They become part of the environment. Something that exists to enhance the atmosphere. Something that completes the scene without ever being the focus as a person. Repetition that removes meaning. The phrase repeated throughout the song is not accidental. It reduces complexity into something simple. It transforms individuality into something interchangeable. And the more it is repeated, the less it represents a person, and the more it becomes a category. Desire without recognition, at this stage the pattern evolves again. There is no interest in understanding. There is no interest in connection. There is only consumption, an endless cycle of wanting more, without ever seeing what is actually there. Energy that prevents reflection. The music moves fast. The tone remains intense. The momentum never slows down long enough to question anything, and that is what allows the message to pass through unnoticed. Because there is no pause to think. Only space to react. A reflection of an entire lifestyle. This is not just one song. It represents a broader culture. A moment in time where excess was not only accepted, but expected and celebrated without restraint. And this is where everything becomes clear. There is no deeper layer left to uncover. No hidden meaning waiting beneath the surface. Everything is exactly as it appears. The final step is next. What began as subtle control has now transformed into something completely exposed. And what comes next does not try to soften itself at all. Number 1, Used to Love Her. When violence is turned into a punchline. This is where everything finally breaks. There is no metaphor to interpret, no layered meaning to unpack, no distance between the message and what it implies. Everything is said directly. And that is what makes it the most disturbing. Because this is no longer about control or desire. Used to Love Her by Guns N' Roses presents something far darker. A relationship that does not end with separation, not with distance, not with emotional fallout, but with violence. And it is delivered without hesitation. There is no sense of conflict, no regret in the tone, no moment of reflection that questions what has happened. Instead, it is framed as resolution. As if the problem has been solved. Humor that makes it more uncomfortable. What makes this even harder to process is the way it is presented. Light, almost playful, carried by a tone that suggests it is not meant to be taken seriously. And that contrast creates something deeply unsettling, because it turns something brutal into something that feels like a joke. When the line completely disappears, at this point the progression reaches its final stage. What started as subtle control became threats, then blurred boundaries, then obsession, then power, then objectification, then excess, and now there is nothing left to hide behind. A reflection that cannot be ignored. This is not just about one song. It is about how far a message can go and still be accepted, played, shared, sung along to. And that is what makes it stay with you, not just because of what it says, but because of how easily it was received. Because once you hear it clearly, it stops being just music and becomes something else entirely.